Evolution is something that has troubled a great deal of Christians and swayed many people from accepting the possibility of a biblical God. I think the biggest reason for this is that theologians have historically had a certain way of interpreting the Bible and are not strongly convinced by the evidence for evolution. This lack of conviction in scientific theory causes people to either question science or question their faith. Others have come to the conclusion that Genesis is completely allegorical and isn't intended to describe literal creation. But are all of these doubts, questions, and concerns even necessary? Does Genesis really contradict evolutionary theory? I'm your host, Chris Tain, and you are listening to the Canon of Reason Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about me, or about this show, please visit my page on the Canon of Reason website www.canonofreason.com/Chris. As a community of believers, we need to understand that we interpret things within the context of our knowledge. This means that the way Genesis was understood hundreds of years ago may not be the same as the way our generation approaches the text. While Genesis itself is still relevant, the context through which it was understood might not reflect an accurate understanding. This means that we need to consider the validity of modern scientific theory. We need to also consider the possibility that the way we understand a specific text may not be correct. The text itself may not be wrong, but our understanding of it may need to be updated. Am I telling you to believe in evolution? Of course not. At the core, it is only important that we understand the points that Genesis is making, and how the narrative fits into the overarching biblical story. However, I am telling you to consider how evolution may align with the literal text of the Bible. For the purposes of discussing evolution, I intend to start with Genesis 1:20. In our first episode, The Bible and the Big Bang, we explored how the Big Bang aligns with the Genesis narrative. We will resume that discussion here, with verses 20 and 21 from Genesis. Then God said, "Let the waters swarm and abundantly produce living creatures, and let birds soar above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed, according to their kind, and every winged bird, according to its kind, and God saw that it was good and he affirmed and sustained it. This part of the creation narrative takes place at the beginning of the fifth era, or Yom, and describes the beginning of life beyond plants on earth. The first thing that we notice here is that Genesis does not explicitly state how God creates animals. God could have used any number of means to create animals, including evolution. In fact, if we look closely at the phrasing being used throughout Genesis 1, it aligns very well with evolution. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. Let the waters swarm and abundantly produce living creatures. Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. Each of these phrases implies that God commanded the earth to produce something, and that the earth complied. This is precisely what the theory of abiogenesis describes, the emergence of life from non-living matter. Evolution then accompanies abiogenesis, by describing the physical process through which early life transformed into something more complex. The theory of evolution seems to agree that animal life likely began in the water, slowly moving to nearby land, and finally to the air. Genesis does not contradict this. In fact, when it lists examples, they are given in an order that loosely represents what evolution has found. There are studies that indicate the first birds evolved in aquatic environments. In evolutionary theory, there is an event that occurred roughly 540 million years ago that is referred to as the Big Bang of evolution. It is also referred to as the Cambrian explosion. During this event there is an inexplicably rapid rate of evolution resulting in a multitude of life forms. I am sure that it will be explained by science at some point, at least theoretically, but I do find it interesting that there seems to be so many Big Bang events aligning with biblical creation. From Genesis 1, verses 22 to 23, "And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day." Here we recognize that God is blessing the animals he created and instructing the sea creatures and birds to propagate and maintain themselves. The fact that God does not directly reference the creatures that move, described in verse 21, could be indicating that God is not ready for them to explode in population when he ends this particular era. Of the animals that God excluded, a small percentage will eventually become reptile mammalian creatures, setting the stage for God to initiate the beginning of mammals. The overwhelming majority of these creatures, however, will become dinosaurs. Remember that it is this category of creature that was not instructed to be fruitful and multiply, and it is also this category of creature that is eventually almost entirely wiped out by mass extinction. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind," and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Genesis 1, verses 24 to 25. With this verse, we start the sixth era, or Yom, when God brings forth creatures to dominate the land. This would have been around 100 million years ago when early reptile mammalian creatures split into four major groups. The Loraciotheres, a hugely diverse group including all the hoofed mammals, whales, bats, and dogs. The Euarchontogliers, which are primates, rodents and others. The Xenarthra, including anteaters and armadillos. And finally, Aphotheres, or elephants, aardvarks and others. How the reptile mammalian creatures split into these groups is currently unclear. While the Bible does not quite separate these groups in the same way, I believe that it is referencing the same core creatures. The source Hebrew references something that could be translated as livestock, or cattle in the American Standard Version of the Bible. Livestock and other synonyms would largely refer to hoofed mammals. The source Hebrew also refers to something that could be translated as land crawler, which is generally considered to be reptiles and other crawling land animals. Remember that evolutionary theory is describing reptiles that split into groups, some of which stayed reptiles, a few of which began slowly transitioning into mammals. It is interesting to find a word in the source Hebrew which could so clearly represent the evolutionary process proposed as the beginning of mammals. The final group mentioned in the source Hebrew here are wild animals, sometimes also translated as beasts. Given that the logical place to separate these eras is during the peak of the dinosaurs, the dual meaning of the source Hebrew is again very interesting. Dinosaurs could be considered beasts, as could elephants and rhinos. If you have been paying extra close attention, you know that there is still one group remaining that the biblical text has not yet mentioned, but they are about to emerge in both the biblical and evolutionary narrative. Evolutionary theory identifies this era, roughly 75 million years ago, as the time when primates begin to arise. It is important to note that the terms used within the Bible so far do not conjure images of monkeys. This may be because they are included as wild animals, or it could be that they were the launchpad for humanity. Let's dive a little further into this era after a quick sponsored break. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast, in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started, you won't regret it. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Genesis 1, verses 26 to 27. Here God creates man. Again, there is no indication of how, merely that God spoke and then it happened. Keep in mind that we have not reached the biblical creation of Adam at this point, as this is still in the sixth day or era. This process would have started with the division of the four groups of mammals and finished with modern humanity splitting from the other primates just 6 million years ago. And the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. Genesis 2, verses 1-2. After the sixth day or era, God finishes his work and rests. During this time mankind increases in population and continues to evolve. The real question for modern Christians here is whether or not this can be reconciled with the creation of Adam and Eve. Most interpretations of the Hebrew version of Genesis take liberties with the text in an effort to make it more readable for its target audience. King James, American Standard, Common English are all versions which are adapted to their audience. I am not going to say that this is a bad thing, but when trying to truly understand what the Bible is saying, when we really want to know if modern theory aligns with biblical truth, we need to look at the source Hebrew rather than a single interpretation. Each interpretation is derived from someone else's experience and knowledge, and is vulnerable to the interpreter's personal understanding of the intention of the text. These are the very things that we are calling into question, whether or not a new way of viewing the history of the world aligns with what is documented in the Bible and whether or not this new view is in contrast with the source Hebrew. In many translations, Genesis 2:4 sounds as though the story of Adam is taking place on the sixth day. The source Hebrew does not indicate this. The Lord God took some soil from the ground and made a man. God breathed life into the man, and the man started breathing. The Lord made a garden in a place called Eden, which was in the east, and he put the man there. Genesis 2, verses 7 and 8. This is the first time God creates something individually by name, and in this translation of the Bible, it sounds as though God is literally taking soil from the ground. This is a vastly different method of creation than had been identified in the previous chapter. Why would God suddenly change his approach to creation? Theologians have varying responses to such a question. Perhaps Genesis 2 is focusing in on more detail of the sixth yom than Genesis 1, or perhaps humanity required extra attention since we are being created in God's image. While these are great opinions, they presume that the English translation being used is an adequate description of God's creative effort. Let's take a look at a more direct translation from the source Hebrew for comparison. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. This is a very different sentence from the one we had read before, and this is taken directly from the Hebrew as literally as possible. If we examine the text closely, we find that this literal translation aligns far better with the earlier described methods of creation. All animal life was formed from the earth, as well as all vegetation. God commands the earth to bring forth living creatures during the sixth yom, and as a result, all animal life, including humanity, came from the earth, from the ground. Science refers to this as abiogenesis, the emergence of life from non-living matter, and how this is achieved remains a mystery to this day. But the undeniable fact is that we are all formed from the earth. If I were to ask you where you came from, you might respond by saying that you came from your parents and your parents came from your grandparents. But did you come from your grandparents? Indirectly, yes, of course, you did. If your parents had never existed, neither would you. You are a direct result of your grandparents' existence. And the same is true for your great-grandparents and so on, all the way back to the first human couple. This fact is undeniable for Christians and evolutionists alike. So let's take it a step further and ask the following question. If Adam was formed from dust and Adam is your ancestor, were you also formed from dust? Again, yes, in the same way that you were formed from your grandparents, or great-grandparents, or your great-great-grandparents, you were also formed from the dust of the earth. If God had never commanded the earth to bring forth life, if abiogenesis had never occurred, you would not exist, therefore you are the direct result of the earth bringing forth life, and thus you were formed from the dust. This same logic can be applied to Adam, whether he was formed directly from the dust, as many English interpretations imply, or if he happened to be the result of an evolutionary process commanded by God during the sixth Yom when he commanded the earth to bring forth living creatures. Once again, we can see how evolutionary theory does not directly contradict the source Hebrew of the book of Genesis. The next part of this verse, where God breathed the breath of life into Adam, covers yet another scientific mystery, sentience or self-awareness. The breath of life is an act that is not described for the creation of any other living creature in the Bible. It is not even described for Eve when she is created from Adam's rib. If we look closely at the language used here, we will see that the breath of life is very much another way of saying that God is kindling the soul or the spirit of life. The Hebrew word translated here as breath is described by the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon of the Old Testament as the breath of God as hot wind kindling a flame. Except that God is not kindling a literal flame here, he is kindling life. It is not possible to kindle a flame if there is no existing flame, or spark, to kindle. Thus, Adam must have already had some form of life, such as that of a tree or a flower. A flower is alive, but there is no evidence that it is self-aware. When God kindles this flame, it grows into something more, something that is self-aware and capable of God's traits. Love, mercy, forgiveness, and so on. The emergence of sentient life, as opposed to life in general, is not something that can be estimated by science. We can estimate the beginning of intelligence, or of a species, but not sentience. In fact, the existence of sentience is not something that can be confirmed at all. Philosophers have debated this issue for centuries, and even have a term for a creature which exhibits sentience, but is not actually sentient. These kind of creatures are referred to as philosophical zombies, and will be the topic of a future episode. If we adopt the evolutionary process as God's creation model, then sentience must be the differentiating factor between Adam and any primates that may have existed before him. Our self-awareness is what allows us to feel empathy and gives us the ability to relate to others, understanding their needs, their desires, and their pain. Our sentience gives us the ability to purposely be merciful, forgiving, and loving. It is the very thing that allows us to relate to God. It is how we are made in God's image. If God is love, and our sentience is what allows us to love, then it must be our sentience which allows us to be like God. Genesis also provides some direct evidence that other people existed along with Adam and Eve. This can be found in the story of Cain and Abel, after Cain murders his brother and is punished by God. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Look, you have now banished me from the ground. I must avoid you and be a constant wanderer on the earth. Anyone may kill me at sight." Genesis 4, verses 13 to 14. Here Cain is afraid that other people, outside of his immediate family, will see him and kill him. It is also important to note that God acknowledges this concern by marking Cain so that others will know not to touch him. God does not go to Adam and give him a commandment not to take vengeance on Cain. He simply provides Cain with a mark that other people will recognize and fear. It is imperative that we ask the following question. If a creature is not sentient, if it is not self-aware and in control of its actions, then who or what is in control of that creature? Science may claim that the creature is completely controlled by its genetics, by chemical and electrical responses to stimuli, and the Christian may respond that God is in control of the creature's genetics. So what sort of stimuli are we talking about here? Stimuli can be physical or auditory in nature, provoking a reaction to a bite or to a rustling in some bushes, but it can also be visual, such as a mark, which all creatures would avoid as much as possible. Is this why God chose to mark Cain, rather than issue a commandment to his people? After all, how does one issue a commandment to non-sentient creatures? I hope you have enjoyed walking through this view of creation with me. I know I certainly enjoyed exploring the subject. Personally, I remain unconvinced of either approach to these topics. Whether we view creation as 6, 24-hour periods, or as 6, unspecified periods, does not impact the overarching biblical narrative. Many people have introduced the topic of death as evidence that evolution does not align with Genesis. Adam is told by God that he will surely die if he eats from the tree of knowledge, and as a result, they claim that death did not exist at all prior to Adam's sin. I do not hold this view. After all, you cannot eat a blackberry without denying life to its drupelets, or seeds, which are already composed of living cells, which will die when they are digested. However, this topic, as well as the topic of sentience, are subjects which will require their own episodes in order to fully unpack. I sincerely hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you would like to support this podcast, please share it with your family and friends, and make sure you subscribe as well, that way you will be notified about new episodes. If you would like to support Canon of Reason in other ways, please look for the listener support link in the episode description. I would like to reach a point where I can devote enough time to the show that I am able to release new episodes every day, and I will need your support in order to accomplish this goal. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, may God be with you all.